Hello third year historians and welcome to the next lesson. It's been a couple of weeks since we've had a recorded lesson, so this one is continuing what we've been talking about with Victorian health and housing and the slums, and we are going to do a Victorian murder mystery to start the lesson off. So our learning intention for this particular PowerPoint in this lesson is to investigate what dangers existed for the poor in an industrial city, and in particular we're thinking about health dangers. So to start us off, we have a murder mystery. This woman has been found dead in her house by her family. There is no sign of struggle, there is no breaking or entering, and no murder weapon has been found. The body has no marks on it, and she was alive 10 minutes before her daughter went out to fetch some water so they could boil some for tea. No one can explain her cause of death. Your task is to use the evidence sheets that are on the team and provided on the next couple of slides to help work out what actually killed this woman and solve this mystery. What you're going to need to do is think about the following thing for each source that you see and fill it in on the sheet as we go. So you're looking at the source and you're thinking, first of all, what can you see? What can you learn from the evidence that is there? What does this evidence tell you about the cause of death for this woman? And what can I use from this evidence to support this? So can you use something that this piece of evidence says or does or has to prove that you are right in whatever you think is actually the cause of death? So you'll need a copy of this sheet. It is attached to the team as both a Word document and a PDF. If you can't download it to fill it in, that's totally fine. You can print it if you can, and if you can't print it, you can just draw it out in your jotter or on some paper like this. I would really recommend that you turn your page so that it is landscape and not portrait, and you can have all that space to kind of fill it in. You only need to maybe give, if you're doing it in a lined sort of space over 2 pages of a jotter, maybe you only maybe need to give like 3 or 4 lines per box, and there are 6 pieces of evidence that you're going to use. So pause the video if you need to copy this out at roughly about 2 minutes and 45 seconds, and then we'll move on. So piece of evidence number 1. This is a photograph of the victim and her family taken about 4 or 5 days before she died. You can see that she lives in a very cramped space, very cramped conditions, which probably means that it is maybe slum housing, so there'll be lots of different families living there, and it might not be the most clean and tidy of spaces. You can see here in the bottom corner, which I will just draw a wee yellow line around, this is their outhouse, which would have been above their cesspit, their area for going to the toilet. So obviously that means that there isn't sewers or things like that for the waste, so that's something to keep in mind. So this is piece of evidence number 1. So think about the questions that you're being asked in general and see what you can write into your boxes. Pause the video and come back to it once you've filled in your boxes. Okay, piece of evidence number 2. This is the body of the victim. Her name is Elizabeth. She has a husband and 5 children. Obviously no one's dared to go near the body because it's Victorian times and we are very suspicious, and we're not sure exactly what happened to her. So again, think about what you can actually see from the woman. She's lying in a bed, but there's not any blankets and things like that, so it's probably a good shout that she's not a very well off woman. She looks quite thin and quite gaunt, so maybe she's lost a lot of weight recently, so that's something to kind of keep in mind as well. Again, pause it and fill in your table, and then come back for the next piece of evidence. Okay, third piece of evidence is an official statement taken by the Victorian police from Elizabeth's daughter Alice, and what she says is, 1 minute she, that's her mum, was fine, and then all of a sudden she started vomiting and had a dreadful case of diarrhoea. I made sure that she went to bed, but I then had to go to work. When I came back, her skin had turned a blue-black colour. It was horrendous. Her eyes had sunk into her head. She really looked a mess. It was horrible having to watch her struggling to breathe, but then it was so quiet. I knew that the best thing that could have happened did, and she no longer had to suffer. I still have no idea to what caused her to become so ill. However, I have heard something about a disease called cholera. So she's talking about obviously what had happened to her mother in just a space of a few hours, and it had made her vomit and have diarrhea, and she's been very sick, and that's obviously what has killed her. But what has caused this? So pause it, fill in your table for box 3, and then come back to box number 4. So box number 4 gives you a cross section of Elizabeth's house and her yard, where her garden and things are, and you can see the pump and the privy on this, which if I just highlight in yellow here, here's the pump, and this is where they get their water from. This is the water line going down here. On the other side, in blue here, this is the privy. And here you can see underneath that is the cesspool, underneath there, and here's where the water is. So we know, based on what we've talked about with the cesspools and things so far, that it was obviously waste from the toilet was stored in the cesspool or a cesspit, which meant it had to be emptied by night soil men. However, this was quite expensive. There's no way of this getting sort of out of there without it being lifted and dug up and then emptied and things like that and brought back and then replanted. So some landlords didn't actually want to pay for it, so they just let the waste overflow, which could sometimes leak into the water supply. So pause it, fill in your stuff for box 4 and come back for box number 5. So evidence piece number 5. This is a map of the street where Elizabeth lives. Each of the black lines that you can see, which I am just going to sort of highlight in yellow a little bit so you can kind of see where they are, what I'm talking about. Each of these black lines represents one death from this mystery vomiting and diarrhea bug, which seems to be going around this whole city because there's an awful lot of them. However, what I want you to think about with this map is, what do you actually notice? What is the important part that we're looking at where each of the main deaths are happening? Elizabeth lives on Broad Street, and she lives roughly about here. So think about what you can see happening in that and fill in boxes for number 5. Okay, last piece of evidence. This is from Punch magazine in 1866, and it was a cartoon which has a caption that says "Death's Dispensant, open to the poor free of charge," and you can see that it's something like the Grim Reaper sort of thing, giving out free water to the poor people of Broad Street in London and things in general. And you can tell that they're poor people because they're coming here for their water and things as well. But some of them won't be because they have shoes on. Some of the poorer ones won't. So this is your last piece of evidence. Pause the video here at about 8 minutes and 55 seconds and fill in your table. Okay, so hopefully you've filled in your table with all of the pieces of evidence that we've got. If you haven't done that, go back and do that and make sure that you do this as we're going, because then that way it's not going to be too much work for you to do at the end. You fill this in your jotter or wherever you're filling it in with all of your pieces of evidence, and you're thinking in particular about these questions at the top. So what can you see in each one? What can you learn from each one? What does it make you think about the cause of death in each one? And what evidence do you have to support it? Doesn't have to be too detailed, it can be just 1 or 2 bullet points or just 1 sentence. Fill it in and then come back to the next slide. So the question becomes, who was the culprit? Who has murdered this Victorian woman, Elizabeth? And the culprit is a condition called cholera. Now, cholera is an infection that is quite often fatal. It's a disease that you get from drinking contaminated or dirty water, and it causes severe vomiting and diarrhoea. Roughly, it kills around about 120,000 people a year still in our society, in places where the water is maybe not so clean, or they don't have the same sort of level of water treating sort of things, or just any sort of sewers and things like that as well. In Victorian times, this was a very common condition, and it is spread from person to person through this dirty water, and if you're using the same water source, it can then lead to you being very, very ill. You're going to use the privy, and if the cesspits are overflowing, then it's going to just pass back into the water source. So it was very, very deadly in Victorian times. So 3 things that we're trying to do for this part of the lesson, now that we've worked out what it was, is define what cholera is. We want to explain how it was spreading in the growing industrial cities, and explain how the people got the epidemic ultimately under control. So this yellow highlighted bit here, if you can write that in somewhere to make sure that you've got it, and that means that we've met the first one of our criteria boxes. Quite often it was sometimes known as the Victorian Plague, because obviously it's not the bubonic plague which happened in medieval times, but it was kind of still similar, the same sort of idea. It spread really quickly, especially in the poor areas. Some people refer to it as King Cholera, or made the point that London, which was such a big and busy city, an industrial city, was King Cholera's court, and that was a big deal at this point in time. So we'll look at that in a wee bit more detail. So we're thinking about how you get it. Okay, so basically it's caused and spread through drinking dirty water, so water that is infected. At this point in time, in this industrial sort of growing city, most waste materials that were produced by factories and by people in homes and things like that were dumped into rivers, so like the Thames for example. And unfortunately that is where they got most of their water sources from. So this water was then piped back into the cities, and it didn't have the same water treatment that water we have nowadays would have, and it would be coming through these sort of pipe areas into these pumps, which are often right beside these cesspits. As we already saw as well, most of these sort of Victorian homes in these poorer areas are in very, very poor condition. They're overcrowded, they can be damp and rotten, they don't have drains or sewers and things like that. And if you have a landlord which is not willing to empty out your waste materials, then that means that your cesspit is going to be overflowing, and it is going to result in it contaminating the water supply. Basically what this would look like then, in this really badly drawn thing, so I apologise for that, is you've got your shared toilet above your cesspit, and your cesspit fills up. In theory what should happen is when this actually fills in completely, it should then be emptied out and redug, sort of reinforced and put back in, but again very, very expensive. Unfortunately beside this you have a shared water source. So when this bit of soil, if this pit is overflowing into the soil and it is wearing away, when this bit erodes, ultimately what happens is that the shared water source more or less becomes contaminated. So what happens is ultimately the waste kind of water will start to sort of pour into this kind of shared water source as well, and then it'll start to contaminate the water source. The problem that you also have is, even if you have someone that is then emptying the cesspit, as we said, the factories and all those sort of things, and these sort of night soilmen would be dumping this waste material back into the Thames, and ultimately this would then actually be the main sort of source of water that you're getting, that would be leading back into this water source. So either way, you're very likely to find that your water source sometimes becomes contaminated. not particularly nice. So where did cholera actually come from? We don't have an exact place in the world where we know for the very fact that cholera came from very originally, but the very first time that we ever see it in Britain happens in Sunderland in roughly about October of 1831. A ship carrying sailors who were very, very unwell with a sickness and diarrhea bug docked at the port, and they were obviously very ill, and one or two of them did actually die, and the rest of them did manage to get better, but we weren't exactly sure how. However, from Sutherland, the disease then did spread northwards into Scotland and southwards down towards London. Before it had actually run its course and disappeared again for a while, it had claimed roughly about 52,000 lives from this kind of one space. So by the time it actually reached Sutherland, the point is that British doctors actually knew what cholera was and what it did. The problem was no one knew how to prevent it or to treat the development or spread of it, because the discovery of germs, which is what the cause of cholera is, actually didn't happen until roughly about 34 years after this infection was present. People thought that disease was spread by toxic air or bad vibes, and that's how you got ill. It was you'd breathed in some toxic air and your body had gone to a bad vibe, and that was what made you ill. And that's what doctors did and studied. They didn't really believe in germs and things like that. When they start to talk about this idea that there possibly could be germs in the water, this is kind of what they're talking about. So this is a cartoon called Monster Soup, which is from the Thames, supposed to be a drop of water from the Thames, and this woman, this privileged rich woman with her cup of tea, is supposed to be looking through a microscope, not a telescope, a microscope at a drop of water from the Thames. And it was kind of done as a satire sort of way. They're making fun of it with this idea that some doctors at the time, and one in particular, a guy called John Snow, who we're going to come back to, had said that these little creatures, these things, existed in everything, and it was them that made us sick, not the bad air and the bad vibes. And this is what they kind of produced, this idea that there were germs. These are kind of what people thought germs might look like. They're kind of making fun of them a little bit. They're like lots of little monsters that live in this that we can't see unless we're looking through a microscope. And obviously this woman has dropped her cup of tea in sheer disgust of whatever it is that she's actually seeing here with these scary, strange monsters. So if you were thinking about how cholera actually did spread in these growing cities, the industrial cities were a perfect place for it because there were a lot of different health problems. So quick task for you to do in your jotters or wherever you're writing your notes in, or if you're typing them, think about all of the different health problems that you think that you could see in a British city at this point in time, and you can use this diagram to help you. So use what you know already based on the slum housing documentary you've seen and all the other things that we've looked at with the cesspits and things as well, to think about what you actually would know, and maybe just do it as a describe question or even just a bullet point list of some of the health problems. Try to look for 4 or 5 that you might find in a British city. So you can pause the video here at about 19 minutes and 5 seconds and do the task and then come back to it. So if you haven't managed to finish the describe question on the last slide, you can use this bullet point list to fill it in and make sure that you've got these written into your jotter or your notes or wherever you're doing your information for this. So obviously overcrowding, as we said, major issue in especially the slum areas of the British city, which can cause a lot of health problems. A lot of people living quite closely together like that can mean that things like disease spreads really easily. And again, diseases are not a particularly good thing to get in Victorian times, especially if you're poor, because the doctors obviously are very expensive and not everyone can afford medicine and access to a doctor at this point in time. If you obviously do see a doctor, it doesn't always mean they're going to be able to cure you, because again, things like attaching leeches and bloodletting is still common practice to try and cure you of your various conditions, and that's obviously not going to work if it's something that needs to be treated as a germ, as we've seen, but isn't actually being seen as that. The unhygienic conditions, a lot of people are living where they're dumping their rubbish out into the streets, or cesspits and things are overflowing. There's also vermin, so rats and things being attracted, so that leads to different health problems like being bitten and scratched and things like that by the vermin. It's obviously going to be really mucky and really dirty, not particularly nice in these sort of unhygienic areas as well. Because obviously the buildings are quite close together, or people are working in factories and things like that, there's a lot of health problems that comes with a lack of sunlight, and that means that they're going to have a lack of vitamin D. They're not going to be able to get a lot of that, and that can lead to conditions like things like rickets and stuff, where they're not able to actually get their bones developing properly and things, because they're lacking this really crucial vitamin. Their housing's obviously very poor, which we've looked at in quite a lot of detail. That's going to be a health problem, because if you are ill, you're not going to be able to get better, because your house is maybe very damp or drafty or whatever it might be. And then we've got our contaminated water supplies, which means that you might be unwell and you're drinking water to try and make yourself better, but you're drinking contaminated water, so that will obviously make things spread a lot more. So the question is, what happened? Eventually, a doctor called Jon Snow, and here he is pictured here, not to be confused with the Game of Thrones Jon Snow, helped develop the theory that disease was a waterborne disease in terms of cholera, so it was something that came from contaminated water. And how he actually managed to do this was he mapped out all of the incidences of cholera in sort of the city area where it came about, and then they combined it with the data about how water companies supplied the households and where they got their water from. So where the water actually came from. So did it come from the Thames? Whereabouts in the Thames? Was it near factories and things like that? Or was it near sort of cesspits and things as well? This is a copy of his map, which is very similar to the one that we saw as evidence in Elizabeth's murder. And you can see on it all of the red sort of bits. Each red bit represents one person who has died of this vomiting and sickness cholera disease, and each of the blue circles represents a water pump. And what he was finding is that the people who used the Broad Street well, the pump on Broad Street, were actually the ones around this sort of general area. So sort of these people all tended to use this one pump here, and they were finding that obviously this is where the majority of the cholera cases actually were. So it led him to believe that this particular pump was contaminated, and there was only one way to obviously stop the contamination, and that was to remove the handle of the pump. However, when he took his views to the government and explained that this is how cholera was spreading in the growing industrial cities, they didn't believe him, and they called him a madman. And so what they did instead was they sent out this leaflet, and they put it up all around Victorian Britain, on doors and things like that, in public places and on the pumps, to help people understand how to prevent cholera from spreading and from happening. And there's 6 kind of things that you should definitely do on this list. Number 1, every person needs to be washed perfectly clean morning and evening, which is actually a really good thing to do, but will not prevent you having cholera. Number 2, every room needs to be cleaned and swept every day and well washed at least once a week. Again, very good practice, but again will not stop you having cholera. Let no rubbish nor dirt lie about the door nor near the house, because they believed, again, remember, dirty air, contaminated air is what got you. Again, isn't necessarily going to help with cholera. It'll help with other things, and it'll help it look clean. Let off all stagnant water, so throw away water that's been sitting, which is a good thing to do, but again, if that water's not contaminated, it won't help you. Let the house be whitewashed with hot lime, So make it clean with hot lime, which is something they used to use on the slave ships to try and also keep things clean and things as well. And number 6, beware of drunkenness. Nothing is so likely to bring on disease. So basically, according to them, only drunk people would get the disease, and it's this idea that all poor people are drunk people in Victorian Britain because they were drinking a lot, because that was all they really could do to escape their problems. And the advice that they give is, if anyone is seized with sickness, slight vomiting and purging, which is the diarrhoea, a burning heat at the stomach with cramps in various parts of the body and a feeling of cold all over, it probably is the cholera. And that's basically it. If you have it, that's the end for you. So 2 questions for you to answer based on this piece of evidence that you can see here on the prevention. The first question asks, what ways could cholera be prevented according to the government? So 2 examples, write it in your notes or your jotter. And question 2, what do you notice about the government's possible intentions behind this advertisement? So what are they trying to say? Who are they trying to kind of blame for cholera maybe being there? And what type of people are they saying would likely catch cholera? So answer the 2 questions in your notes and then move the video on to the next task. Okay, so for this task, what we're going to do is there's a couple of video clips on YouTube which you can see here, so you can type them in and they'll also be posted on your team as links, so you'll be able to click them. You're going to write down 5 fingers from each of the videos on what Jon Snow did and how the epidemic was gotten under control into your jotter. So I'm looking for 5 facts from each of the videos. So you're going to have 15 bullet points altogether, or if you really want to, what you can do is you can draw around your hand and you can do that 3 times. So draw around your hand, and in the drawing of your hand, not on your actual hand, you would write a fact in each of your fingers, and then you could decorate your hands in a kind of germy cholera Victorian Britain way if that's what you would like to do to make it look a wee bit more interesting. So pause the video at 27 and 20 seconds, watch the clips and then come back to do the next couple of tasks to finish off. So hopefully now you've watched the videos and we're now thinking about what Jon Snow actually found. Basically, he proved that the people that got the water from the companies that got their water from the most contaminated part of the Thames and closely to the overflowing cesspits were the most likely to suffer from the disease. Not the poor people or the people that are living in the slums necessarily. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're getting your water from this pump, you're going to get it. And he continued to do this work until the Broad Street outbreak led him to actually draw, which is now a famous map, which we looked at, of the cholera incidents, and to find this pump you can see in the background here. This single water pump was the source of the contamination that killed Elizabeth and everyone else that was living in Broad Street at this point in time. It was quite a serious issue, and when they eventually did believe him, they didn't know what to do to try and control the epidemic. But it turns out there's a really easy way to do that. They took the handle off the pump. So with no handle, they weren't able to pump the water and nobody could get water from this particular contaminated source. And when they did that and they had to use the other pumps that were not contaminated, the epidemic was suddenly brought under control. And the pump is actually still there today. This is a modern picture of it. It's not got the handle obviously and probably is no longer contaminated, but it is still there and you can go visit it if you're ever in Broad Street in London. It's got a wee plaque that says Jon Snow and all about him, and that's it there. So, your upload task for this week. We're going to try a how fully skills question about cholera. Now, remember, you've done these questions before. You use aid to help you answer the question. So you read the source and you are looking for 3 things that the source tells you about cholera and 3 things that you now know, based on this lesson, that the source doesn't tell you, that you can fill in with more information about it. What the question's basically asking you to do is describe, remember, how fully the source tells you about something. So you start off by answering the question, so you always say quite fully but not totally. you can get up to 3 marks, so 3 things that the source says, and any 3 things or 4 things that the source doesn't say. So you're looking to divide it at least 3 and 3, or 2 and 4, whatever you can do. If you think you know more than you can find in the source, then you put 2 source points and 4 things from your own knowledge, or you do 3 and 3, which is the easiest thing for you to do. So remember, it goes like this. So you use answer, and you always write the same sentence. So the source quite fully describes the outbreak of cholera, because that's the question, but not totally, as it misses out some key facts. We then do a new sentence, and it says the source says, and you just pick something about cholera from the source and you just write it as a full quote, which means, and then you can say something about it. The source also mentions, and then you pick a second quote, so pick something else, which means, and then you tell me what that means in your own words. Again, just a short sentence. And then finally the source states your third quote, which means, and the same thing again. Then you start a new sentence by saying however. The source misses some important reasons or facts about cholera. The source doesn't tell us, and tell me something. So if you say the source doesn't say anything about how you get cholera, you then have to tell me how you get cholera, because otherwise you're pointing out the source is missing it, but you're missing it as well. So you have to say something like, the source doesn't tell us about how you get cholera. I know it comes from contaminated water. And then you do that twice after that. So the source also doesn't say anything about why doctors couldn't cure it. I know that they didn't believe in germs. Something like that. So 3 facts from the source and 3 things from your own head. So here's your question again for you to do. It will be in the assignments tab as well. Complete it and upload it, or email it to your teacher, whatever is easier for you if you're struggling with the assignments tab, and let us know if you have any questions.